Think forward. Think Research Channel.
Good evening. Shalom and aloha, or as we say here, shaloha. Thanks for coming this evening to the second of Dr. Yehuda Bauer's 4 lectures on racism and genocide. Let me take a few moments as folks come in to thank the other men and women who made these seminars and the public lectures possible. Some are here, others could not be. Organizing the visit of a scholar takes the time and effort of a considerable number of people. It also takes funds. The visit would not be possible without a grant to the university from the Gross family of New York, who arranged with former President Evan Dobell for a series of annual contributions to Jewish life and studies here at UH. President McLean approved the use of this year's grant for Yehuda's visit. I think we can all be thankful for that vital contribution and the wisdom to use this year's monies in that way. Additionally, Dean Hughes of the College of Arts and Humanities, Dean Dubinowski of the College of Social Sciences, and Dean Avi Soifer of the Richardson School of Law contributed funds and assisted in other ways to the smooth workings of this visit, a smoothness which I hope continues. As did Jim Mankey, who publicized these activities by faxing press releases all over the known Hawaiian world, the chair of the History Department, Herb Ziegler, a Holocaust scholar and author of an important work on the SS, Karen Lee, President McLean's invaluable assistant, and 2 equally invaluable secretaries in the History Department, Susan Abey and Gwen Agina. Those 4 combined forces to ensure the necessities of academic life for Yehuda: an office with a window, a working computer, phone, and email connections, a place to stay in Manoa Valley, and most importantly, most vitally, a UH parking permit. Good for any spot, whether or not it is before or after 4 p.m. You have become the parking Mashiach. Todah Rabbah and mahalo for those contributions. On Monday night, we heard an articulate and engaging talk about radical Islam, notably its origins, its development, and the threat it poses as a compelling ideology in the modern and contemporary world. Among Yehuda's many suggested points was the ideological nature of radical Islam, an argument which contributes not only to defining what radical Islam is and is not, but also to the ways one might effectively address it. Yehuda concluded with 4 measures to address this global threat, measures which included force, but also ideas and economics. Many of us heard the resounding echo of Hannah Arendt in the effort to comprehend political Islam as an ideology, a powerful reminder of the totalitarian threat facing much of the world in the 1930s and 1940s, and of the responses practiced and not practiced back then. Might we consider radical Islam an example of a new totalitarianism, of a new fascism? For some, there's been just such a frightening déjà vu. Fritz Stern, the prominent German historian at Columbia, among others, has heard similar bootsteps before and hears them again. As an historian, though, Yehuda suggested, importantly, both the similarities and the differences between this current threat to an open society and those previous ones. He reminded us who seek analogies and comparisons that the differences are at least as important as the similarities. Tonight we hear about and can discuss a further compelling issue with its own connected set of analogies and comparisons with the past, the new anti-Semitism, or the contemporary examples of this protean longest hatred. As with Monday's talk, this subject also tragically bridges racism and genocide, linking ideas and actions with utopian ideologies in a world where, with increasing regularity and increasing viciousness, Jews, Israel, and their institutions are attacked in person, place, and the media. Frighteningly often in the name of Judaicide, all too often in the pursuit of purifying the world of Jews and Judaism. We've all read about and heard about physical attacks on Jewish students, synagogues, cemeteries, even kosher butcher shops in parts of Europe, notably France, during the past several years. We are well aware of the attacks on not just Israeli policy, but also the right of Israel to exist as a sovereign Jewish state across the globe, not only in Arab countries. We've seen a convergence of events since September 11th and the start of the Second Intifada, which might or might not be significantly connected, which might or might not be part of Monday's topic, radical Islam. The chronological and geological convergence makes one wonder, but a wonderment that needs not eliminate, but rather intensifies exactly what Yehuda brings to the lectern: the need to look and analyze closely, to see if there are connections rather than simply assuming that they are, and if so, what they are and what can be done about them in an intelligent, educated manner. It is also convergence which invites us to ask why and where anti-Semitic measures are taken, such as rallies in support of Jewish communities. The recent history of Marseille and Paris, for example, reveal attacks on Jews that gets plenty of press, but they also have revealed vocal public opposition to those attacks. In other words, as historians and citizens, we can ask, what is new about these events and the ideas associated with them? Are they anti-Semitic or not? Why do they occur when they do, where they do, and not in other places at other times? Are all attacks against Israel anti-Semitic attacks? Might some be and others not? Is this the revival of older animosities and failures to tolerate and integrate in Europe, Asia, and the Middle East in particular, and/or newer crises in those societies? Should we read Philip Roth's new novel and fear a resurgence of a burst of anti-Semitism in the United States? I look forward to Yehuda's placing both the familiar and the unfamiliar, the recognizable and the strange, in their historical context, so we might better be able to know what is connected and what is disconnected from the past, and in doing so find practical and realistic ways to repair the world, to practice an informed and enduring tikkun olam for ourselves and others. Doing so takes, among so much else, an educated, reasoned, engaging approach to public life, defining, understanding, addressing, and eliminating anti-Semitism for its own sake, and its sake as a virulent form of a wider disease of racism. It is a strange world in which Ariel Sharon can be called Hitler. It is a strange world in which Jews call other Jews anti-Semites. Some twists are not so strange, though. Many anti-Semites are just that, anti-Semites. If it looks like a rat, scurries across the floor like a rat, and nibbles cheese like a rat, is it a rat? In true Talmudic tradition, one of us says yes, one says no, and the third says maybe. Nat Henoff of the Village Voice wrote a few years back that he would not be surprised if loudspeakers in New York City called all Jews to Times Square. Mel Gibson's The Passion was selling out at the Cineplex, and many of us were Albee singers from Annie Hall, hearing Wagner as he walked into every single music store. Then shortly, Leon Wieseltier of the New Republic cried shame and argued American Jews were the most fortunate Jews in the history of Judaism. This debate, heated at times, said a great deal about precisely what Yehuda Bauer will talk about: the question of what is new about new anti-Semitism, what is even anti-Semitism about the new anti-Semitism. Or as the old story goes, two Jews in Warsaw are lined up against a wall and threatened. One is shouting obscenities, cursing at the mob. His friend turns to him and implores him, "Nu, shut up. We don't want to anger them. They might be anti-Semites and hurt us." Yehuda brings us today's topic, the experiences and scholarship that Robert mentioned on Monday, including formal education at the University of Wales, in Cardiff and Hebrew University, as well as teaching and scholarship in Israel and abroad, often in the United States. He was a visiting professor here at UH Manoa in 1992, at Yale the following year, and most recently at Clark University in Worcester, Mass. Amidst his numerous public lectures and papers, Yehuda delivered a speech at the Bundestag in 1998 on Holocaust Memorial Day, a speech reprinted in Rethinking the Holocaust, published in 2001, and at last year's Stockholm meeting on the prevention of genocide. Those and others have directly or indirectly addressed the questions of racism and anti-Semitism, new and old. As film buffs, and as a precursor, I suppose, to the Kurt Kashmir Film Festival this weekend, I was also pleased and I enjoyed noting that in his CV, Yehuda had served as an advisor to Lanzmann's epic documentary Shoah, the award-winning Partisans of Vilna, and various other film and television productions. In addition to his important work on the Holocaust itself, which Dr. Ziegel will introduce on Monday, and Yehuda will talk about the seminar tomorrow and Monday, is an important complement. Yehuda has spent much time and effort studying racism and anti-Semitism, confirming by close research, clear analysis, and compelling writing that one cannot truly understand the history of the Holocaust without understanding the history of anti-Semitism, or the history of genocide without understanding the history of racism. One need not have read Goldhagen to come to that conclusion, though for some a dose of Goldhagen seemed necessary to turn anti-Semitism to the front and center, even if he did so in a flawed way. Today's talk, then, is a much appreciated fruit of labors focusing on the problem of anti-Semitism, both its historical examples and its more contemporary ones, a topic which Yehuda has published and talked extensively, and for which he helped establish an important institutional base as founding chair of the Vidal-Sassoon International Center for the Study of Anti-Semitism at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem during the 1980s and early 1990s. We all know the importance of having an institutional base for scholarship. The clarity of Yehuda's thinking and writing, which is not to say that he is not controversial and provocative, asks us to consider relationships between official anti-Semitism as a matter of state policy and the anti-Semitism of the streets, anti-Semitism in the West and anti-Semitism in the non-Western world, notably the Arab or Islamic world. These are social and political categories of observation and analysis, which at least invite us to distinguish parts of this blob-like monster to better understand, control, and prevent. Is this anti-Semitism with local causes and objectives? Is this anti-Semitism which understands Jews in Israel in more global terms and has more global ambitions? On the day after the United Nations officially recognized and commemorated the 60th anniversary of the liberation of the death camps, and on the day that it still has not taken significant actions against the genocide in the Sudan, and that it still retains the odors of the Zionism is racism proclamation, and in the many statements and proclamations of the Durban Conference, I can think of no better scholar to try and untangle such knots and their connections to anti-Semitism, both new waves and old ones, timeless and contemporary, than Dr. Yehuda Bauer, our esteemed visiting scholar and friend from Yad Vashem and the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. Yehuda.
Thank you very much for the introduction, and let me do a bit of introducing myself. I will call now on Ilana, my wife, to introduce my lecture.
Good evening. I'll play for you a Jewish, very ancient Jewish song.
Thank you, Ilana. No, it's not new anti-Semitism at all. It's a mixture of a historical development, of a continuity, and some new elements, or some, let us say, changed elements in it. So the answer to the title of the lecture is negative. But I think we ought to start by something else. Anti-Semitism, that's a term that was coined by an anti-Semite by the name of Wilhelm Marr, a racist, nationalist, German journalist in 1879, for anti-Semitic reasons. But the term means absolutely nothing, because there's no Semitism that you can be anti to. There are Semitic languages. For instance, in Ethiopia, parts of the population speak a Semitic language. In Eritrea, the Semitic languages are about as close to each other as Indo-European languages are. German and French and English and Spanish, and in Asia, Sanskrit and Pali and their derivatives from that. Now, you can't have anti-European, anti-Indo-Europeanism. In the same way you can't have anti-Semitism. It makes absolutely no sense. Marr coined that term because he didn't like the old term of Jew hatred, in German Judenhass, which had Christian connotations, and he was anti-Christian. He didn't want to use that term. This was a new era, more or less, nationalism, racism, nationalist ideologies, violent nationalist ideologies. He needed a pseudo-scientific new term. It sounded scientific enough. Anti-Semitism sounds very intellectual. But of course, everybody knew what he meant. I mean, this was clearly directed not against Semites, but against Jews. Because Semites, there's no such thing. I mean, there are people who speak Semitic languages. So the term actually is nonsense. It is even more nonsense when you think that we now use it to cover every anti-Jewish movement, sentiment, ideology, and so on, from 2,000 and more years ago till today, in all kinds of places, in all kinds of situations, in different types of economies. We use it for sort of a mild anti-Jewish sentiment, like you have anti-other people sentiments. So we had an investigation in Kiev some years ago, and we asked the local Ukrainian population, who do you dislike most? And there were about 30-odd possibilities. And Jews came in number 13, more or less in the middle. And there were groups that were much more disliked than the Jews were. So is that anti-Semitism? And we use it for anything between these extremes of sort of moderate feeling of discomfort to murderous ideology. It wants to kill the Jews. So the way that we use it is absolutely wrong. The original term was anti-Semitismus, written in one word. And Americans and British have changed that into an even worse idiocy. They split the term, anti, hyphen, and then Semitism with a capital S. It makes absolute nonsense of any kind of intellectual analysis of the phenomenon. Having said that, I'm going to use it just as all the others use it. And the reason is very simple. I haven't got any other term. Jew hatred, dislike of Jew. Everybody uses it, so I'm not going to argue semantics. But I'm using it at least with a sort of, at the back of my mind, with the knowledge I'm using the wrong term for what I want to describe. Now, the basic question, if you want to answer the questions about 2005 on anti-Semitism, you have to go back and find out, if you can, if it's possible, where this comes from. It's a $64,000 question, you see. Where does anti-Semitism come from? Why are people anti-Semitic, or anti-Jewish, or moderately, or not so moderately? I think the first kind of clear statement I find is in the Bible. It's the book of Esther. It's a very peculiar kind of book, very, very odd. Because it seems quite obvious that the Persian Empire, which is described there as having a prime minister, a vizier who wanted to kill all the Jews, never persecuted Jews. It was the only empire that was actively pro-Jewish. Who is Esther, the heroine of the story? Esther Hadassah is Astarte, Phoenician goddess. Who is Mordechai? Mordechai is Marduk, the Babylonian god to whom children were sacrificed. So the question is, what does a nice Jewish girl with a peculiar name, with an uncle who supports her, who has the name of a Babylonian murderous god, do at a court of a Persian king who never persecuted Jews? It's an allegory. And it's an allegory that was not written by Persians, certainly not. It was written by Jews. It expresses fear. And it describes 200-300 years before the Christian era, something like that. It describes the possibility of an annihilation of the Jews of the diaspora. The whole Persian Empire. It's an allegory for what? We don't really know, we have no idea. But I think it expresses a deep-seated fear. A fear not of the Persians, of the Jews, or some kind of Persians, not the real ones, some kind of Persians who are hiding behind that allegory of Persians. But a fear of the Jews, of what the surrounding populations might do. And the reason for that is stated in chapter 5 of the book of Esther. Why are the Jews supposedly being threatened with annihilation? Because they do not observe the customs of the king. Anyone here who knows some Hebrew? Ki einam shom'im ledatei hamelech. Or einam osim et datei. They don't follow, they don't do. Dat, the Hebrew term dat, today means religion. But historically, it meant really customs, habits, including religious observance, yes. So the whole thing, you see, the difference between Jewish civilization and culture, as we would call it today, and the surrounding, that seems to have been the probably justified or justifiable fear of the people who wrote that book. Now, does that answer the question where anti-Semitism, wrongly termed, yes, where it comes from? I think so. I think it does. At least in my mind, I think it's a good answer, unless I get a better one. I'm going to stick to that one. It seems that the origin of anti-Jewishness is the fact that Jewish civilization and culture were different from those of the surroundings in meaningful ways. Not that the gods are the same gods with different names, which was a customary thing. And the customs more or less were similar between the different ethnic groups, tribal groups, so on. With the Jews, it went deeper than that. Because you see, all right, monotheism. Monotheism is not a Jewish invention. The sun god was worshipped in Egypt before that as the only god, and for a short period of time. The Shabbat, the day of rest, is a Babylonian thing. The word is Babylonian. Now, in Babylon, of course, it meant a weekly holiday for the higher-ups, for the better classes, you see. The Jews turned it into something general for the whole population, for slaves, for animals, for the land, for the earth itself. That was revolutionary. Couldn't be accepted. If everybody was had rest days, like slaves would have rest days, where would we be? Who could build it? The wonderful buildings that the ancient empires built, the wonderful civilizations. In a way, the Jews developed a society, a culture, a way of thinking, if you will, that was retrogressive. Had it been accepted by everybody, maybe those wonderful civilizations wouldn't have arisen. And now, if the Jews had stayed in their country, anyone who visited Israel here may have seen, probably must have seen, there are still those terraces on the hills. That's where the Jews come from. If they had stayed in that place and had continued to engage in acrobatic agriculture, on those terraces with mules or with oxen, eking out a living as peasants, then there would have been another oddity. There's plenty of oddities in the world. But they spread. They weren't exiled. It's nonsense. The Romans did not chase out the Jews from Palestine. They took whatever the number was of slaves and sold them in markets. But the majority of the population remained. The majority of the Jewish population remained in the land of Israel, Palestine, whatever you might call it, same place. So, the Jews went into exile, but then they, you see, willingly, in part, and lots of people joined them in the early period, in the first century probably of the Christian era. The number of Jews in the Roman Empire multiplied. Why? Because of natural increase? Hardly. Because of the terrific cultural crisis that the Roman Empire underwent, and people wanted to do something else, not follow the old pagan polytheistic beliefs of Greeks and Romans. They wanted something new. And quite a number of them joined the Jews, and then an even larger number joined the Christians. But Christianity, when it developed, went away from the ethnic identity with the Jewish people. And the Jews stuck to their ancient civilization and culture. And they carried this load on their backs. This culture, this civilization, which they had developed with them to the various places where they went. And then, of course, you see, Jewish historians very often present the history of the Jewish people as the history of their persecutions. Not true. Most of the time, in most of the places, the Jews were not persecuted. They may not have been loved. Sometimes they were invited. Very often, they were tolerated. They were accepted. There's another group. There were many groups. They were one of them. And yes, the whole thing was punctuated by persecutions when there crises occurred in the host societies. And then sometimes, by no means always, sometimes it turned against the Jews, especially in the area of the monotheistic civilizations, Christianity and Islam. There was no persecution of the Jews in India, for instance. There was a fairly important Jewish community in India which has been there since before the Christian era, most likely, in the area of southwest India, in Cochin and its environments. Yes, there were wars, and yes, there were problems, never on a religious basis, on an ethnic basis. Jews were not hit because they were Jews, but because there were struggles between various lords of the areas, with different interests, and so on and so forth. There was never any persecution of the Jews in India. Hinduism was, at least until recently, a understanding religion. You will immediately have noticed that I should have used the word tolerant, but I won't. Because when you say, I want to tolerate Jews, that means that you dislike them intensely, but you are prepared to tolerate them. If you say, I want to tolerate any group, Muslims, Christians, any ethnic group, it means not that you want to live with them, but that you have no choice, or you don't want to have any choice, and you just sort of tolerate them. Instead of tolerance, I prefer to use understanding and respect. Instead of intolerance, I would use hatred, discrimination, persecution, and similar terms. So you see, in most of Jewish history, you have this dialectical tension between long periods of relative quiet, of development of ordinary life, and then, as I said, punctuated with persecutions when there's a crisis, which doesn't necessarily, and I have to repeat that, turn against the Jews, even in monotheistic areas, such as, for instance, Georgia and the Caucasus. There's been a Jewish community there for well over 2,000 years. Georgia accepted Christianity in the early Middle Ages. Yes, there were individual anti-Semites. Sure, one of them is very well known. Yosef Vissarionovich Djugashvili, better known as Stalin. And a Abkhazian, which is the next door ethnicity, Lavrenti Beria. Yes, they were anti-Semites, but there was never an anti-Semitic movement in Georgia. There was never an anti-Semitic party. Jews were never persecuted in Georgia. It was a Christian country. So it doesn't necessarily have to happen. And we have to ask ourselves, then why does it happen? What are the types of crises that will produce anti-Semitic reactions? Now, the truth of the matter is I don't know the answer, because research on anti-Semitism is still ongoing, and not everything has been solved by a very long way. But let me say something. You see, when Christianity develops, it develops in opposition to Judaism because it has to differentiate itself from it. And doing so, it has to differentiate itself and attack the father religion from which it comes, but it cannot go the whole way. And while the early church fathers sometimes spout speeches that, with some small changes, could have been published by Der Stürmer in Germany in the 1930s, other church fathers said, yes, you should persecute the Jews, you should discriminate against them, but you must not kill them because they have souls. And in any case, the second coming of Christ cannot occur without the Jews being present, because they have then to convert at least some of them. So, Christianity doesn't like Jews. It discriminates against them. It's willing to persecute them. But the theology prevents any kind of genocidal attack. And while there have been, as we all know, mass murders of Jews during the Crusades, in the 17th century in Poland, in the 18th century in Poland, and so on. These are against the theology. And in the Middle Ages, bishops and popes who had propagandized against the Jews then have to intervene to rescue them from the mob that has been incited by them. Yet never throughout the centuries of Christian anti-Semitism has there been a genocidal attack on the Jews. Genocide is out. Persecution, okay. Mass murder against the theology must be stopped. Genocide, no. It is the secularization of Christianity, of Christian anti-Semitism, that produces modern anti-Semitism. Because the moral obstacles to a mass murder of the Jews are set aside when you turn against Christianity on a secular basis. And so you are left with Christian anti-Semitism without the Christianity, and then you have pure anti-Semitism, which then develops according to its own rules and laws. Now you see, the late 19th century is the era when the rise of nationalisms clearly sets the nation, the ethnicity, apart from the others, the ones who are not part of the ethnicity and the nationalisms. And the others desperately try to enter into these ethnicities and nationalisms. This is exactly the situation of the Jews. The Jews in Western and Central Europe want to be part of the new ethnicities and nationalities as they develop. But they are not locals. They are strangers. The only non-Europeans in Europe in the 19th century were the Jews and the Gypsies. And so, Gypsies for a quite different reason, but the Jews are disliked. They are not part of it. Yes, they have to be accepted because you cannot develop a new society, a liberal capitalist society, without tolerance. So the Jews are tolerated. And very often because they have this basis of intellectual education, they rise because they are basically middle-class people, even in pre-capitalist society. They rise within this new capitalist society. There's an intellectual group that grows stronger and stronger. They penetrate into the societies. They want to be part of it. And in these nationalistic, ethnically segregated groups, the Jews are the other. They become the paradigmatic other. Racism may not be the result of development of the 19th century. There is clear evidence of racist thinking in the Iberian Peninsula in the 15th, 16th, 17th centuries. But I'm not sure that that background really determines the rise of racism in Central Europe, Central and Western Europe, I should say, in the 19th century. Not at all. The basis for modern racism was given by Gobineau, a French writer, Arthur de Gobineau, in 1853 and 1854 in books that he wrote, which are, by the way, not anti-Semitic at all. But racist, in other words, the new idea of racism. It turns against the Jews because we are of a different race. What is the basis of race? I'll come back to that in my next lecture again. But what is the basis of race? There's no basis to it whatsoever. See, humanity comes from Africa. We all come from Africa originally. Some of our ancestors spent too much time in northern climates, so the pigmentation changed a bit. But we are all Africans, basically. There's no such thing as a race. It's a pseudoscience, a pseudoscientific thinking. And it is that thinking that penetrates into the consciousness of part of the intellectual elite in Europe and America. France, Britain, Germany, Russia, less so, America. And part of it turns against the Jews. Now, I don't want to enter into the question of National Socialism. I don't have time for that. I want to make a fast forward, because the background is important, the background is essential, in order to see what happened since 1945. The people who argue against me talk about new anti-Semitism, this is a new phenomenon, spread of anti-Semitism in the world. They completely ignore the fact that we are now in the fourth wave of anti-Semitism since 1945. In the Western world, incorrectly so called. It includes Japan and the Americas and so on. 1958 to 1960, 1978 to 1982, 1987 to 1992-3 were three waves that preceded the present one. Why do I call them waves? Because all over the Western world, right, from Stockholm to Buenos Aires and from, I don't know, San Francisco to I don't know where, you have the same kind of thing happening, clearly not directed from any center. There are no protocols of the haters of Zion. It's something that occurs for some unknown reason at the same time in many, many places and takes rather similar forms. In 1958, for instance, there was a wave of desecration of Jewish cemeteries and paintings on Jewish synagogues, but everywhere. It's quite clear that some of these young hooligans who did that had no idea that it was done at the same time somewhere else. I'm of the generation that was raised on the idea that anti-Semitism can be explained by economic factors. But those three waves contradict that. 1987 was a very prosperous year. There was no particular political crisis either. The collapse of the Soviet Empire came 2 years later. The first Intifada came after the outbreak of this wave. So, neither economic nor necessarily political crises, in this case, created this wave. So where does it come from? We made a series of studies at the Hebrew University, and one of the fascinating results was that we found that there was apparently the kind of thing that you in Hawaii should be well aware of, magma under the surface, waiting to explode, where the Earth's surface is thin. The magma, under certain conditions, will disrupt the surface, will explode, will come up in the form of a volcanic explosion. This apparently, I mean, you know, the metaphors like that are never very exact, but apparently something like that is happening with anti-Semitism in the Western world. There is a continuing level of latent anti-Semitism because of the difference in cultures and civilizations, because of the deep-seated feeling in the cultures in which the Jews are living, that these people represent something different, something strange, very often something frightening, because everything else has disappeared and the Jews are still there. The Jews are wandering all over the world. How come? Isn't that something odd? Isn't that something satanic? Isn't that something frightening? And when you have this kind of a feeling, then the ideology will come. Yes, there will be economic factors. Yes, there will be political factors. Yes, there will be other factors. And the main factors, of course, will be ideological, in this case religious, theological. You know, when we were young and Marxist, or some of us, we thought, you know, theology as a factor, well, you know, that's the superstructure. It's not something serious. No, it's not. It's very serious indeed. Because the theology itself is a reflection of reality, of course. And then the theology and the impacts on the society becomes a factor of its own. And I think that is the basic explanation why the difference in culture and civilization is then turned into a tool, into a weapon, when it's needed. And the immediate causes are then become very important. In the case of the Nazi ideology, which I'm not going to get into, you have the defeat of Germany in World War I, the economic crisis, the social disruption, all the things that we all wrote about and read about. Fast forward to 1999, and then you see you have a question, a major question. The Israeli-Palestinian confrontation. How important is that in this last fourth wave in which we apparently are, although there are ups and downs, and 1999 is not the same as 2001, and 2003 is not the same as 2001 either, so it's not as easy as all that. But there is a wave, there's no doubt about that. And it does have a connection with the confrontation. How important is it? Well, it is important, there's no doubt. The propaganda that is directed against Jews and against, I'll come back to that in a moment, the state of Israel, obviously has an immediate connection with the Second Intifada. Does that mean that if an Israeli-Palestinian compromise were found, even a temporary one, even a partial one, would that affect present anti-Semitism? I think so, yes. I think it would. It would decrease the level of anti-Semitic commitment by those who act out anti-Semitism. Would that make it disappear? No, not at all. Because this is a trigger, an important trigger. A trigger based on a reality. But it's a trigger, it's not the underlying reason. Let me now go into a partial analysis, because I don't have that much time, of Europe. In Europe there are three types of anti-Semitism. One is the traditional one, the right-wing, neo-Nazi, skinhead. Yes, there are a few thousand of these people in most of the European countries, I think in all of them. Including the new ones, you know, the new additions to the European Union. But this is marginal. Now, let's not ignore marginal situations. I mean, Adolf Hitler became a member of a very, very marginal group in 1920 in Munich. And 13 years later he was in power. So let us not ignore marginal situations by any means. But it is marginal. It is not the main thing. And when you attack that with the traditional ways, with legislation and police and demonstrations, Peter Hoffenberg quoted, "Demonstrations in Marseille." Come on. Any kind of anti-Semitic action in the past was always counteracted with exactly the same manifestations of anti-Semitism. Did that help? Well, sometimes it did, and mostly it didn't. I can show you in France, in the same France, in the 1920s and 1930s, anti-Semitic attacks, and then people going with the same way, with candles in the streets, opposing anti-Semitism. That doesn't mean much. What we see is two other kinds of anti-Semitism. One is that of disaffected, desperate, largely unemployed, second-generation young Muslims, mostly Moroccans. Almost all, I haven't really seen a real sort of exception to this, so I say almost all. The attacks, physical attacks on Jews in France were done by these young people. And it was their way of expressing their frustration with their lack of integration into French society, with their tremendous rate of unemployment, with the discrimination they encounter in schools and jobs and everywhere else when they do have jobs. And they take it out on who? On the symbol. They know about the Israeli-Palestinian confrontation like I know about I don't know what, about some strange animals. They heard about it. And the Jews, of course, are the enemies because the tradition says so. The third type is the anti-Semitism of the chattering classes. The media, the intelligentsia, the universities, the doctors and the engineers, the church people very often. In England especially, not so much on the continent. Bishop of Guildford is an excellent example of that. What we see is a sudden rise of this with the Second Intifada. Now, let me not exaggerate. There's a lot of opposition to this type of anti-Semitism in those very chattering classes. I mean, it's not as though this was a sort of a clear, unanimous view. No. But there is an atmosphere. 2 years ago, the French ambassador to the United Kingdom at a cocktail party referred to Israel as a shitty little country. He was overheard by a journalist who published it next day in British papers, in a British paper. Now the thing is not this despicable individual, the French ambassador to the United Kingdom. The interesting thing is that he felt absolutely comfortable at a cocktail party of the best type of British, leadership, intellectual leadership, to make that comment without any fear of being contradicted. That is the issue. And then, of course, the question immediately arises. When you criticize Israel, is that anti-Semitic? And the answer is no, it isn't. When you criticize the Sharon government, and nobody criticizes the Sharon government more than the Israeli press, much harsher than anything you can read outside, except, of course, for cartoons identifying Sharon as a Nazi, except, of course, as identifying Israel as a Nazi state. But criticism of the government, sure, every day. So, just as I have the right to criticize, let me not use the United States as an example, just as I have the right to criticize Tony Blair, okay, or Chirac, or Berlusconi, or anyone else. I'm not an Italian, I'm not French, I'm not British. But I live in a democratic world, and I have the right to criticize another government's head, or another government, for its policies. That doesn't mean to say that I'm against the existence of Great Britain as a state. Doesn't mean to say that I want to annihilate the British people, or the French, or the Italians. There's a clear differentiation. When you attack a certain policy, that's legitimate. When you turn that attack into attack on the people and on the state as such, then in fact you advocate its annihilation, which turns you into a genocidal ideologue. Because when you say that Israel has no right to exist, what are you saying? You are saying that Israel should be destroyed, which means that its people should be destroyed. You can't destroy the state without destroying the people. And that is a genocidal policy. Anti-Israelism, in that sense, is genocidal. What is anti-Zionism? Well, it depends what you mean by Zionism, you see. Zionism now, very calmly, very, thoughtfully, is the national movement of the Jewish people that argues two basic propositions. One is that those Jews who feel like it are one people spread all over the world, and those who feel like it see in Israel the political and hopefully the cultural center of that people. That's Zionism. And then you have radical left-wing, radical right-wing, radical center, radical anything, and non-radical anything included in all that. So you have Zionists of all kinds of stripes of opinion and views and so on and so forth. But what I mean when I talk about anti-Zionism is not that. It is the idea that the Jews, and only the Jews, have no right to a separate ethnic national existence. They are not a people. Which is what Yasser Arafat of blessed memory used to say. Now, when you say, I am against all nationalism, I want a universalist world, I want a world in which there are no differences between people who speak different languages and come from different cultures, then you are stupid. But it's legitimate. I don't know of any of these people who argue that kind of argument, kind of anti-Semitic argument, that really say that. What they mean is that the only people who don't have the right for self-determination are the Jews. Mahathir Mohamad in Malaysia said this very clearly. And Malaysia is a very good example. If I am against the existence of a Malaysian state, and I don't believe in the right of the Malay people and the Chinese minority in it to have any kind of independence, then I'm anti-Malay. If I say the same about Israel, I'm anti-Jewish. What's so difficult about that? But you see, these are differentiations that people have difficulties in making. And the fact that they have difficulties in making makes the thing so dangerous. So that's a third kind, the chattering classes. You have this in the United States too, but it's marginal. It's limited largely to the young generations in universities. And looking back over the past 4 decades of visiting the United States almost every year, I remember exactly that the same things were said, about the young students getting all anti-Zionist and anti-Jewish and so on. The same thing was said in the 1960s, 1970s, 1980s, 1990s. But it's still there. A colleague of mine, whom I value very, very much, Professor Omer Bartov at Brown University, published an article which Peter Hoffman gave me yesterday. The dateline of that article is today, 26th of January. So he sent out that article before it was published. And having met Omer Bartov only a few weeks ago and discussed this with him, when Peter gave me that article, I immediately immersed myself in it because I knew it would it would say exactly what I am saying, only much better. And he quotes a group at Rutgers University calling itself the New Jersey Solidarity, Activists for the Destruction of Israel. Now, the interesting thing is not what they say, So there are students there who have genocidal thinking, victims of genocidal thinking. What is dangerous is the reaction of Rutgers University. And it's the same in France, and especially in Britain, which is the center of this, and in other countries. They say, and I quote, intrinsic to Rutgers' own mission is the free exchange of ideas and discourse on a variety of issues, including those that are controversial. So, some people say Nazis are okay, and some people say Nazis are not okay. Controversial, you see, you can have a controversy about that. The extermination of the Jews is viewed by some people as positive and by some people by negative. You have different views, you know. So you have freedom of expression in academia. This attacks the very basics of democratic thinking. This kind of stuff. This kind of intelligent stuff by professors. And I always say to my students, beware of professors. One can go on with this if one has time. When one doesn't have time, one goes on and hopes that the questions that will come will enable me to go into some more of this stuff. How do you fight this? There are naive people, especially Jews, who think that Jewish organizations fighting anti-Semitism can defeat anti-Semitism. Absolutely wrong. Jewish organizations fighting anti-Semitism are very important in nations or in countries where there is, in any case, a very solid opposition to anti-Semitism, such as in the United States. Because in the United States, anti-Semitism is marginal, very marginal. The same applies to some of the European countries. There, the ADL and the American Jewish Committee and all the others are doing excellent work and can be successful. And because they have allies, local allies. But consider for a moment the situation in the Soviet Union, when the Soviet Union was engaged on really an anti-Semitic binge. Could the ADL influence the Soviet Union? No. But it could influence together with non-Jews, only together with non-Jews. The United States and other countries to exert pressure on the Soviet Union to let the Jews out. And that helped. So alone, the Jews cannot do more than yell, which is important, very important, because that's where it starts. Then they have to find allies. And the allies will come when the allies realize that anti-Semitism starts with the Jews. This is an old cliche, but doesn't end with the Jews. And it's true. The last time anti-Semitism took over a major state in the world, it cost a world war and some 35 million dead in Europe before that scourge was eliminated, and with it, it's anti-Semitism. Now, not that the anti-Semitism disappeared afterwards, but the anti-Semitism of the Nazis disappeared obviously with the Nazis. So, it's not simple. You cannot answer the question of anti-Semitism simply by saying you organize groups and so on. And there's another thing. And that comes back to my lecture 2 days ago. Radical Islam is not anti-Semitic. Radical Islam is anti-Semitic in a genocidal way. And it is very important to realize what these people are saying. Let me give you just one quote. Again, I have my own quotes here, but I'm using Omer Bartov, which, we have the same source. The charter of the Hamas radical Islamic organization in Palestine. The Zionist Jewish enemies have been scheming for a long time, they say. They accumulated a huge and influential material wealth, which permitted them to take over control of the world media, such as news agencies, the press, publication houses, broadcasting, and the like. They also used this wealth to stir revolutions in various parts of the globe in order to fulfill their interests and pick the fruits. They stood behind the French and the communist revolutions, and behind most of the revolutions we hear about. They also used their money to establish clandestine organizations which are spread around the world in order to destroy societies and carry out Zionist interests. Such organizations are the Freemasons, Rotary clubs, Lions clubs, B'nai B'rith, and the like. All of them are destructive spying organizations. They also used the money to take over control of the imperialist states and made them colonize many countries in order to exploit the wealth of those countries. They stood behind World War I and took control of many sources of wealth. They obtained the Balfour Declaration and established the League of Nations in order to rule the world. They also stood behind World War II, where they collected immense benefits for trading with war materials and prepared for the establishment of their state. They inspired the United Nations, interesting, isn't it? And the Security Council in order to rule the world. There was no war that broke out anywhere without their fingerprints on it. The forces of imperialism in both the capitalist West, this is 1988, and the communist East support the enemy with all their might in material and human terms. This is 1988. I can quote to you from last year, but I think I might be doing an overkill. It's perfectly obvious. For the first time since World War II, the Jewish people, not only the state of Israel, that's self-understood, the Jewish people are confronted with a genocidal danger. What these people want is another genocide of the Jews. They won't achieve it. They won't achieve it. Not only because of the existence, strength, and so on of the state of Israel, but because this is not the world of the 1930s. But they can do tremendous damage. Tremendous damage. Since 1982, I've been trying to convince the Israeli governments, of all sorts and kinds since then, to wake up, to get allies, to fight this thing. Only in the last few years, the last few governments have begun to realize what this was all about. It took a long time before the major anti-Semitic organizations in the United States and elsewhere began to talk about this. And then they talk about it again, as I said 2 days ago, in terms of force, using force. That's a very, very partial answer, very partial answer. You need to dig much deeper than that. And there is some hope. There is some hope, because today some of the governments, few, are beginning to realize that they have to act on a different level against these threats, and anti-Semitism is a major one amongst those things. In April of last year, there was a meeting in Berlin of the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, which was initiated by the German government, specifically by the foreign minister of Germany, Joschka Fischer. And 55 countries took part. And they signed the declarations against anti-Semitism and committed themselves to this, that, and the other. It's not going to save the world. It's not going to save the Jewish people, no. But it creates an atmosphere. And if we carry on doing this, then there is, hopefully, a light at the other end of the tunnel, and hopefully it's not the train coming the other way. Thank you very much.